So thanks very much, everybody, for being here for our Centre for the Study of Corruption seminar today. This is one of a series, and the next one up is, in fact, in January with Dan Hough talking about Donald Trump and legal corruption. So I hope you can all come along for that one as well. But our speaker today is Sam Power, who is a lecturer at Sussex, at the Centre for the Study of Corruption, and also has an illustrious history with Sussex, having done his PhD, master's and undergrad here. But he joined us, in fact, from a previous job at the University of Exeter a couple of years ago. So he's come back to us at Sussex. And Sam is an expert on party financing and also has increasingly worked on online campaigning and all of those new forms of campaigning in the past few years. But he's going to be talking today about his work on money in politics. So this will work that Sam's going to talk for about half an hour. Then we'll throw it open to questions and answers. So do be thinking about what questions you've got while he's talking. And hopefully all very informal, so please do come up with all of your questions. Great, Sam, over to you then.
Great, thanks very much, Liz. Thanks everyone for coming. Lovely to see you. This is a bit of a high wire act because I haven't let my dog out and she's currently asleep. So we're going to hope that that remains the case for the next half an hour. But if it doesn't, then apologies. She can sometimes butt in either welcome or unwelcomely. What I want to talk about today, I'll share my screen in a minute, is money in politics to a broad extent. I was just thinking when I was planning it, that most conferences that I ever speak at, there's a title of the thing that I'm going to be speaking about in the program, and it very rarely matches up in any meaningful sense with actually what I do at the conference. But I think this is broadly to do with money in politics, but it's actually a wider project that I'm working on at the moment with a number of colleagues in and around the Electoral Commission spending databases. So I'll share my screen very quickly to get the presentation going and talk you through exactly what that project is. So what the project that I'm working on at the moment with Kate Dommett from Sheffield and a few research associates, Andrew also at the University of Sheffield, and Amber, who works at Tactical Tech, is in a more meaningful sense attempting to understand the business of elections. And what I mean by that is that I think we have a good understanding of, or somewhat of an understanding of the way in which people donate to political parties and the motivations behind it. And we've got a good, very base knowledge of the way in which people, I suppose, spend money at elections, but actually we don't have all that much granular detail or information about precisely how that spending functions at elections. I'll talk through why I think that's important in this presentation, and then give some very early research findings, I suppose, into this project and where this project is going to go. This is a project that's been running over the summer and right up until right up to now, and more and more findings are coming in every day, effectively, from the kind of numbers that we've been crunching. So I'll give you some initial findings, why I think it's useful, and generally why I think perhaps we might need to think about more functionally understanding this business of elections. So why is it important in the first place? I suppose what we should think about is right back to square one and the ideals of electoral democracy broadly, why we think democracy is a good idea and what ideals underpin that. So elections sort of broadly, I suppose, are underpinned by specific and certain principles. And whilst they're specific and certain, there's probably some debate, and you can throw any number of these in there. Annika Gauger suggests that it might be, that we have liberty, equality, and deliberation in our elections. And for an election to be a good election, that needs to be upheld. Michael Johnston suggests that democracy is sort of defined by choice, debate, and representation. And this is all sort of broadly, I suppose, linked to this ideal of majoritarian electoral democracy, that we all, in every 4, 5, 3, 2, however many elections we have, we all have a say in an election. We get to vote, and we weigh the alternatives that are presented to us in a meaningful manner, and those alternatives are presented indeed in a meaningful manner. And we have this ideal that that's how electoral or majoritarian electoral democracy ought to function. But we sort of know that that's a folk theory, that actually electoral democracy doesn't work like that. We don't weigh up the alternatives in a rational manner, and indeed there's a number of ways in which elections don't work to represent us, don't work to give us that choice, debate, and representation. And I suppose as a challenge to this idea of majoritarian electoral democracy, we've had these various understandings of pluralism throughout the ages, from the early Dahl's sort of majoritarian pluralism, the kind of New Haven ideal, the ideal of how representation works in a pluralist society where everyone gets their voice heard equally, to these notions of biased pluralism where certain kinds of people are getting their voices heard more often than others, to your C. Wright Mills idea of economic elite domination, which is that, the game is rigged from the start. And I think that these notions of ways in which elections are perhaps supposed to function and then don't function, and actually the ways in which the ways in which thinkers have challenged that with notions of various pluralist notions, provide a guide to understanding money in politics more generally, and actually democracy more generally. We can understand where perhaps money in politics is causing a problem when it leads to notions, to perhaps the pluralist ideal becoming biased, or an economic elite beginning to dominate. And these are a really useful sort of guide to point out where and when money in politics might be causing a problem, or more generally, where democracy isn't working. And the idea, I suppose, is that elections ought to be underpinned by notions like equal access, informed choice, having an engaged citizenry, having deliberative discussions, and having political competition. Whether that is at elections or otherwise, that is the way in which elections should and ought to function. And traditionally, as party scholars, or I suppose not everyone here is a party scholar, but speaking with my party scholar hat on, traditionally, as a party scholar, we've tried and specialized in understanding certain areas to assess if these ideals are being upheld. So we might research political campaigns to see if they are being, if they're providing informed choice. We might look at voter behavior. We might look at citizen attitudes. We might look, in my field, at party donations. We might look at lobbying and influence politics. And all of these areas of scholarship, all of these areas of academia are designed around, well, not designed around, but in some way answering the question of, is democracy working? And my argument, or what I think, is that an area that has been comparatively understudied is actually the role of external companies and suppliers in the electoral marketplace. There's been some work on consultants and some work on I suppose the professionalization of politics, but not much granular work on exactly the kind of companies that political parties are spending money on at elections, and the kind of influence that those companies have, the kind of things that they do for political parties effectively, or indeed third parties. So why is that? Firstly, there's actually significant barriers to actually studying the business of elections. Most countries do have some kind of disclosure regime, But actually, the problem is that transparency varies wildly. There's some countries where you'll only get some kind of disclosure about either spending or donations, or spending and or donations. But you won't get much information about the kinds of companies that are the election spending is being put towards, and actually even less detail about what those companies are doing. Generally, the best practice in this area happens in the US, the UK, and Canada in terms of their searchable online databases. However, the UK, as far as I'm aware, and if anyone knows of any other countries where this is possible, it would be a great deal of help for me in terms of future research, is one of the few countries where actually in law you're allowed, you have to provide actual invoices of your actual spend at elections above a certain limit, but I'll get onto that in a minute. So that's exactly what we did. We went through, we analysed the 2019 UK general election to ask 3 specific questions. The first was, we've got this database, what can we learn from the general database, the Electoral Commission database, to start off with about the way external suppliers are used in election campaigns. The second is what further information can be gathered to improve on this. So beyond your very basic data, what further information can we gather? And then the third question is, what don't we know and how can we improve transparency? So what don't we know broadly, and how can we improve these examples of best practice to perhaps think about how we can learn more and remove those barriers to studying the business of elections more generally. To do that, our method was to get stuck into the Electoral Commission database. Election spending in the UK is very tightly regulated. As a party, you can spend £19.5 million at an election as an upper limit, although that's a slightly false upper limit because it's £30,000 per constituency that you stand in, and you don't often get, or you never get, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, for example, standing in Northern Ireland. So the actual limit's a bit lower than that. And you have candidate spending limits which vary. What we're looking at is the party spending at the 2019 general election, all of which must be reported to the Electoral Commission in some detail. This has to include receipts and invoices for any spending on any supplier that occurs above £200. And these are made available, any spending above these receipts are made available to view as PDFs. Your spending, when you record it, also must be recorded under one of 10 categories, which I'll get onto in a second. And what we did is we looked at the available invoices for 13,202 declarations provided to the Electoral Commission. So we looked at 13,202 discrete bits of spending at the general election. We analysed those PDFs and then we recoded them based on what we were reading on the invoice, because the spending categories are very broad, and actually what's written on the invoice can often, although I'll get onto it in a minute, be much more informative about what the money was being spent on than simply something that says advertising, for example. So we went through those 13,200 invoices, we analysed them and then recoded them. That was our method to try and get a better understanding of spending at the 2019 general election, but also of precisely this electoral marketplace. Prior to that, though, let's think about research question 1. What does the Electoral Commission database show us in a very general sense? What can we get from the Electoral Commission database? Well, we can get some pretty good initial descriptive information in many ways. So in a very general sense, we can look at total election spend by party across any number, by whichever party that you want to look at, and look at a general story of spending there. So I've just picked out 6 here: the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrat, UKIP, Brexit/Reform, the Green Party and the Scottish National Party. And we can see from things like this that you would argue that at least in spending terms, British politics is two, if not now three party politics in terms of the amount of money that a political party spends and the way in which they dominate the marketplace. But spending is overwhelmingly dominated, apart from in 2005, by the Conservative Party. And indeed, the Liberal Democrats had managed to outspend for the first time since at least I'm aware of them being able to do it, outspent the Labour Party at the 2019 general election. So we can very broadly look at total election spend by party, and that's about all we can get in terms of, and draw some inferences there. We can also break it down further and look at the kinds of spending that political parties were doing at each election under the 10 categories. So we can see that unsolicited material to electors, advertising, and market research and canvassing are by far and away, or at least in from 2015 to 2019, I've put in the EU referendum there as well, are by far and away the biggest spend categories, up to about 80% of spending at the 2019 general election fell under that category. It was some form of advertising, some sort of unsolicited material to electors, or indeed some sort of market research or canvassing. And then we can go one step further still, and we can look at the suppliers that political parties spent the most on through pretty simple searches. And one thing that we see here, if we're thinking about, I suppose, pluralism more generally, is that later on in our analysis, when we recoded some of the invoices, we found that that there's not many suppliers through which are used by multiple parties. But those suppliers that are used by multiple parties, we've shaded here in blue, actually often appear right up at the top of the total spend. So we suggest that actually what this shows is that that perhaps the electoral marketplace is dominated by a few big companies. We can see Facebook, Google, Paragon as clear examples here. Which would suggest that a lot of money is going to this small amount of companies who might well be having an outsized influence, perhaps on the debate, or an outsized influence in setting the debate. So we can find out that as well, and that might tell us something about pluralism more broadly. That's about what we can find out so far. But what further information can be gleaned, and what are the weaknesses in the Electoral Commission database? Research question 2. So the Electoral Commission database is not perfect in any meaningful sense. If we go through these invoices, we see that the invoices don't necessarily match up all that well with the overall picture that we've been getting, perhaps even from some of the descriptive statistics I just flashed up there. So first of all, there's many examples of a complete mismatch between reported spending and the data provided on invoices. Sometimes this is due to a distinction between party and candidate spend, but sometimes this is due to complete human error, effectively. Some invoices, indeed all of the Plaid Cymru invoices, are just blank. They don't provide any detailed information about spending whatsoever, and you just have to take it from the categories that are provided. Some invoices do not get put up, are not provided for spending above £200, and some are just completely unclear. I've got 4 examples of 4 different completely unclear invoices here. The top left, as I'm looking at it, so the McGregor-Boyle invoice, that effectively is just redacted to within an inch of its life, such that you have no idea what McGregor-Boyle are doing for a party, beyond that they've been categorized as advertising, but you don't know anything more about what McGregor-Boyle are doing. The one immediately next to that, the electoral workshop invoice, the tax invoice, that one is just blurry, so you can't read it. The Humphreys sign and print is one of our favourite examples of quite a bad invoice. They've actually stuck a post-it note over all the useful information that you might need on that invoice, such that we don't know what that invoice is providing. And then Hanbury have given an invoice where they just talk about the service in a very roundabout way. So it's a provision of for the provision of services broadly, but we don't know anything about the service they're providing. So whilst the Electoral Commission allows political parties to categorize that spending, if we want to actually know more about what that spending is, the invoices quite often are working against us. They're either redacted, or they have a great deal of or it's quite hard to understand exactly what is going on. And we found that in total 14.3% of all suppliers that are on the Electoral Commission database provided at least one unclear invoice. And then finally, we argue that the categories that the Electoral Commission provide are actually vague and uninformative. So, for example, if you want to look at Facebook spend, if you look at the invoices, then we can broadly see that all Facebook spend is exactly the same, but actually they're categorized under 5 of the different categories on the Electoral Commission database. Or indeed, they don't really provide any reasonable detail about digital spending or digital advertising, and they don't really provide all that much granular detail, these 10 categories. And indeed, we in speaking to the Electoral Commission, or in speaking to I speak to the Electoral Commission quite a lot, we were to understand that the Electoral Commission don't really think that their categories are really up to snuff either. So what we thought we might do is go through all of these invoices and have a sort of iterative process of completely recoding the Electoral Commission database under much more granular categories, but keep sort of 10 broad categories, although we came up with 10 different categories, and then some more granular categories underneath that, such that we might be able to find out some more information. So this is the way in which we did that. We have 10 broad categories of advertising, campaign materials, campaign activity, data and infrastructure, production, consultancy, legal advice, polling, catering, and completely unclear. Quite pleasingly, the completely unclear section there has been obscured by Talking Samuel Power, so it is actually completely unclear, but that says completely unclear. And within that, we subdivided each category. So under advertising, we had merchandise. That can be anything from boxing gloves to flags to badges, newspaper and magazine advertising, social media advertising, other online advertising, other forms of advertising. So other forms of advertising might be things like ad vans, and PR, general public relations work. We then looked at campaign materials. So that was people that designed leaflets, general campaign material printing, paid leaflet delivery, event costs and venue hire, creative content owned by a third party, and translation services for Braille, BSL at speeches and that kind of thing. We then looked at campaign activity, get out the vote, or coded things as campaign activity. That might be get out the vote exercises, fundraising, or phone banking. Data and infrastructure, which is campaign or customer relations management databases that companies set up, data services and analysis, IT infrastructure and support, telecommunications services, mobile application services, email services, and search engine optimization. We then had a production category for video editing, audio editing, and photo editing, consultancy under either communications consultant, a design consultant, a social media strategy consultant, or a data consultant, legal advice, which is its own discrete category, research, and under research we would have polling, focus groups, ordnance survey, message testing, archival research, and other forms of research, and a miscellaneous category which included catering, accommodation, expenses, office infrastructure, physical security, recruitment services, and transport, and whether whether an invoice was completely unclear. We came up with these categories. We had very broad categories to begin with, and then we had meetings every week during the coding to discuss what categories were working, what categories were not working, and then sort of worked to create what we thought were almost the perfect categories for us, given what was being showed in the invoices. So it was a very iterative process of coming up with these categorizations, and the broad categories in bold there also, so they are their own discrete category. If someone just says they are doing advertising, they would go into the broad category, but then we can subdivide it depending on other things. And this provides us with slightly more detail. Unfortunately, the detail that we have is still, so we're still crunching numbers on the detail. So I'm currently going through a process of subdividing the invoices again, such that I can get discrete spending in every single category, because sometimes things were categorized over multiple codes, which I'm hoping to finish next week. But by next week, we should have a clear idea of the exact spending in every single one of these categories. But there's other things that we can do at the moment. So for example, we can compare these categories against the categories as provided to the Electoral Commission. And here we can see again the variance within what is provided in Electoral Commission data, and if we look at things in slightly more detail. So, as might be unsurprising, in the bottom left quadrant here, what we see is the advertises, our general advertising category, as it matches as that matches up to the Electoral Commission. And actually the Electoral Commission's advertising category, of course, is quite closely related to our category, although PR often comes under overheads and administration. If we look above that, we can see that if we look at the kinds of spending that consultants are generally categorized under, then there is a wide variance from market research and canvassing, overheads and general administration, manifesto and referendum material, and indeed advertising. And then finally, if we look at campaign materials, we can see that sometimes that is categorized as advertising, sometimes it's manifesto or referendum material, as we might expect, and sometimes it's sort of campaign broadcasts, rallies, and that kind of thing. So again, what we can do here is get slightly more granular detail about exactly what is going on and exactly how this electoral marketplace is functioning. As I say, what we're aiming to do in the next couple of weeks is to actually break this down even further by spend. And indeed, what we're also doing is a qualitative deep dive into some of the companies that are coming up again and again to see exactly what services they offer, because sometimes the invoices don't provide quite as much as we'd like. So the final research question we have is, how can we use this project, I suppose, to improve transparency? This sort of feeds into the conclusions and sort of future plans of the project. What we hope this project does, and what we hope sort of understanding spending returns and getting a better handle on spending returns can provide, is that it can highlight that there's still much that we don't know, but to borrow a phrase from our good friend Donald Rumsfeld, it kind of pushes us in the direction of having more known knowns and known unknowns, so what we don't know, and less unknown unknowns. What we argue is that actually this election spending in this particular area, actually what providers are doing and suppliers are doing, has been a black box which has been relatively understudied, such that we're moving towards that there's more stuff that we know then we can really work out what we don't know, and then we can perhaps know a little bit more about the unknowns, if you will. We also suggest that despite being a model of best practice, actually studying the Electoral Commission databases has highlighted a whole number of areas where the Electoral Commission database could improve. I could literally talk about how the Electoral Commission database could be improved for 5 or 6 hours. And if there's anyone on this call here that can as well, just drop me a line. But I've got sort of 5 bullet points in ways that I think in this specific area, this could be improved. The first is in the creation of standardized records of suppliers. So actually you have a supplier that is hyperlinked on the Electoral Commission database, and then they are logged in the Electoral Commission database such that you can, such that when parties are recording spending in this way, they can just click from a drop-down menu, Facebook, and then you've got Facebook, and then that would actually create a much more easily navigatable online space, and indeed would make it easier for political parties and campaigners as well. A standardized template for invoices, such that all spending is reported in a consistent way with good formatting, which might then be able to lead to a much easier, make it much easier to actually understand what's going on these invoices. Standard guidance for the uploading of invoice images, such that they're clear and consistently formatted, very similarly. Existing guidance on what should be included in spending returns. So CTF partners, who you would have seen in one of the slides there, had the biggest single spend by anyone at an election, £1.6 million about the Conservative Party spent on CTF partners, and that was either for research or for polling. So half of it went under our general research coding, half of it went on our polling coding, but you don't get much more information than that. And it might be useful to have more clearer guidance on how much detail would be useful on these returns, such that we can learn more from them. And then finally, electoral administrators could configure their transparency databases. So have a look at their transparency databases so that the invoices are easy to access and analyze. Perhaps you can bulk download them. You can do text extraction on them and kind of use machine learning in the way in which it's designed, such that it's a little bit easier to understand what's going on and you don't have to hand code everything. But that might just be a very self-interested, a very particularly self-interested recommendation on my part, so we don't have to do at the 2022-2023 election what we were just exactly what we've just been doing over the summer. So finally, I'll just outline where we're going next with this project. So what this mapping exercise is supposed to be is the start of a comparative project, which will seek to answer 4 main questions about the electoral marketplace, as we call it, about exactly what's going on in the electoral marketplace. Number 1, quite simply, is what's happening, opening up that box and seeing who is operating within this electoral marketplace. The second is, do we see companies operating internationally and across different elections? And do we see almost an elections industry or an elections ecosystem in which particular companies operate? Do we see variance at the country level? So do we see dependent on party system or dependent on all kinds of country-specific factors? Do we see a specific variance in the kinds of spend or indeed the kinds of companies that are being used? And then finally, related right back to my stuff at the start about pluralism and majoritarian democracy, I suppose, does this represent a problem with how democracy is functioning, or perhaps ought to function? Is it a cause for concern, or is it just the nature of the electoral marketplace? Is there a way in which a number of the particular companies do cause concern, and why might that be? But I think it's worth reflecting precisely on whether this is how we want democracy to function, and whether this kind of electoral marketplace is one which is desirable in a democracy. Because my argument is that if we move back to the UK, if we can think about ways in which, in this particular instance, we can get models of best practice right and understand what is going on, in a better sense, perhaps wider concerns can be allayed about electoral influence, about the danger of online campaigning or otherwise. If we can understand truly what is happening at elections and truly understand better this electoral marketplace, perhaps those wider concerns will be controlled or allayed, or indeed vice versa. Perhaps concern will shoot up. I'm an eternal optimist, so I'll go for allayed, but it might well be the opposite. Generally, we see with political financing that the more transparency you get, the less people like what they see. So perhaps my optimism is misplaced. But the idea here is that we really want to understand exactly what's going on in the electoral marketplace to better understand whether it represents a problem or challenge to democracy more broadly. I'll stop there and open the floor for any further questions.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. I think this is our CSC Research Seminar Series, so it's particularly good to see the nitty-gritty of the research process, and all that painful coding of particular invoices is really good to see. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. You can either raise your hand using the Zoom button for raising your hand, or if that's not showing up for you or working, then just you can either type your name in the chat and then I'll come to you and ask you to tell us your question in person, or you can just type the question in the chat and I'll read it out. I'm fine with either. So please do go ahead and start your questions. In the meantime, I have a few myself. So I guess, what I was wondering, Sam, some sort of nitty-gritty around this is, what do we know about how decisions are made about this spending? So if we want to be, looking at the patterns and then trying to decipher from that anything about, whether there is something that is amiss in some respect, wouldn't we need to know how the decisions are being made? And so the sort of questions that follow from that are, how much of this spending is decided centrally versus in constituencies? Do parties have procedures around how they spend? Do they insist on competitive procurement or anything like that? So, some questions about how the decisions are made. And then to your sort of big question around what does this mean for democracy, just wondered if you could go into a bit more what your assumption is about the relationship between spending and pluralism. So when you get those results, what sort of thing would you find as problematic in terms of indicating to you that there isn't pluralism? Because I was just sort of thinking, even if you spend a lot of your money on a certain advertising company, does that mean that you're not getting, those assumptions that you talked about in the beginning, like you're not getting informed voters, or you're not getting equal access and those kinds of things? So what assumptions are you making about how the spending might be interfering with pluralism? And everybody else, do raise your hands. I can't see any yet, but let's go back to Sam. Please do put your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask anything.
Sure. So on how decisions are made about spending, that's one of the things that we think is quite useful about understanding, particularly these notions of the electoral marketplace, is actually seeing the variance in the way in which strategies play out within, perhaps at the party level, precisely around decision making. And I suspect that quite often it reflects some pretty standard institutional realities of political parties. So one thing that we'd like to, one thing that we're going to do once we've got slightly more data on it, is look at precisely the number of suppliers that work across parties and whether they fit into specific categories. And I think that tells us something about the decision making. But one thing just from the coding exercise that we can see is a party like the Liberal Democrats, for example, have very clearly got a much more localized party approach than, for example, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And the way that we can see that is that a lot of the suppliers are the St Albans Liberal Democrats who are doing the printing, or whichever particular constituency association. They might be doing printing for lots of other people, but we can see lots of sort of local Liberal Democrat organisations coming up again and again, which suggests a specific way in which the spending is done. We can also say, again, with this Liberal Democrat example, their spending is quite often small, in lots of small chunks. So I suspect what they're doing is spending as and when they get the money coming in, and spending it on small chunks as decided by local strategy. Whereas the Conservative Party and the Labour Party spend absolutely loads on big chunks here and there. So I suspect that suggests something about general strategy. And the other thing that we'll be able to look at, and that we will look at when we've got a little bit more time, is one thing that's going to be a core sort of question pushing forward, is whether there's people that whether there's particular suppliers that operate either across elections or at specific elections. And what we quite often see, because another thing that we're doing is sort of qualitative deep dives, is you see ex-Conservative Party staffers, for example, setting up a research organisation, then doing a bunch of research at an election for said research organisation. We don't know if they then disappear, because we've only done it at this election, but we do know that a lot of the suppliers have, just from sort of various qualitative deep dives, have some form of history with a particular political party. I don't think there's generally any open tendering processes going on, frankly. I think it's at an election time, you're just trying to get people in, and quite often you're going with who you know. With regards to assumptions about pluralism, our suggestion is not that this is either that this is some kind of fundamental break with a pluralist ideal, if you will. But what it is that the idea of the way in which democracy functions is that lots of people have a say in all kinds of parts of the process. So if you look at, I suppose, on the other side of it, when we're looking at lobbying, the idea is that lots of different people get their voices heard on a particular issue. And our suggestion is, if we're going to interrogate, I suppose, on the supply side, then we should also interrogate it on the demand side, and try and look at, okay, are there particular companies that are coming up again and again, or that are having a lot of money spent on them at elections? And does that have an effect on the debate? So we know that, I can't remember who it was now, and I'm going to end up slandering them if I guess. I think it was Topham, who were a big spender for the Conservative Party. But we know that, just from doing some further research into it, that Topham were the people that came up with the Fact Check UK Twitter handle. So and we know that the Conservatives spent a lot of money on them. So they have some input into strategy and electoral strategy, which has some outcome on the way in which people vote. So we need to know who these people are that are having that kind of a say. And if we look at these invoices, and if we look at the electoral marketplace, we can learn a little bit more about that, and indeed see if that challenges our notions of how we think democracy should function, or actually it reasserts it. It's all fine, but we want to open that black box and have an understanding of who these companies are.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question in the chat, and then I'll come to John, but the question in the chat from Rose Whiffen. Thanks so much, Sam. Were there any interesting patterns in terms of the redactions? Are they more frequent for a particular company, service, or party? Great question there. And then John, could we come to you? And do you want to just quickly introduce yourself, John?
Sure, thanks, Liz. I am a professor of international relations at the University of Exeter. I know Sam because he stayed in my house for several months when he was the visiting lecturer at Exeter. So Sam, I loved your Rumsfeldian conclusion, and the whole setup of the paper, if I can summarize it, was big picture, very quickly into granular detail, and then 5 recommendations as to how what you said was the best system of reporting election finance in the world can nevertheless be improved. So I take it from that you could become a knowledge exchange fellow at the Electoral Commission or the National Audit Office, because they love these contributions. But that's the premise to me asking you about something maybe a little different and away from the paper, but which I think you know about. I was quite interested in where you finished in your response to Liz, where you talked about essentially what I'd say is an economic elite who might be providing electoral advertising services, not just nationally, but internationally. And I think thinking about it as an elite rather than a set of companies. So individual business persons with relationships to the politicians is what's interesting to me. And sounds like something where there would be lots of scope there to tease that out. But anyway, my question was different, and feel free to dodge it because it wasn't in the paper. But given, you know, the wider events of the last few weeks, it's in my mind, and I think you have something to say to it. So I was really interested in the way that you summarize the literature, that we seem to have gone away completely from the kind of C. Wright Mills sociological analysis of political parties. Now, my understanding and my cursory glance at what has erupted with the Owen Paterson scandal is that there's some really interesting things there within the Conservative Party about sociological divides and, you know, a certain kind of generation of politicians who have a long tenure in Parliament. If you look at Paterson himself, those that were lining up in support of him, you know, it may be quite different to some of the Conservatives who were very uneasy about the free line whip to vote to rig the rules in his favour. So, you know, from an elite theory perspective, there's something interesting going on there, I guess. But I wonder if you could say something to that question of whether there's a need for a more sociological analysis of an economic elite, because I think that's where you kind of almost ended for me, or that was the next step in your response to Liz. And it just seems like that kind of approach could get at political corruption in ways which, you know, some of those other models based on a more pluralistic account of the electoral system don't.
Great. I will. That was such a big question that, and one that I want to engage with fully. That I'm going to, because I've got the details for Rose right up on my screen here. That I'm going to deal with Rose, and then I'm going to think about the question of economic elite domination. So we're still ever so slightly working through this, particularly in terms of the redactions. But what we do have is a breakdown of those categories that were completely unclear, and why and where they usually fell. So we've compared essentially our completely unclear categories with the categories from the Electoral Commission. And of all of the completely unclear invoices, 30% of them are advertising, about 30% of them are overheads and general administration, and another 30% about a market research and canvassing, and then it moves around, and then it gets lower and lower from there. What the problem with analysing the completely unclear invoices by sort of definition is that they're completely unclear. So what we have, we're writing up a report at the moment. What we have is, I think, 7 different categories of this is how unclear invoices can look. Generally, when things are redacted, it's not quite. It can just be for any reason, and it's just sometimes things are completely redacted for something that we can't really understand. But I think the headline takeaway is that about 30% advertising, 30% overheads and general administration, and 30% market research and canvassing, essentially with regards to the Electoral Commission categories, though with the caveat that that I think that the Electoral Commission categories could be improved and don't always provide all that much detail. In terms of your question, John, I was glad that you introduced yourself ever so slightly as my former landlord, because I was going to do the same. But yeah, so I think that there is an extent to which we've sort of ever so slightly moved away from this understanding of economic elite domination. And I've been trying, I suppose, in the past couple of years to think about why that is, and sort of moving away from these sociological theories of networks and the way in which elite networks function. The last really good scholar that I can remember doing stuff on this in a systematic way was Matthew Bond in the sort of mid-2000s. But I think that what we're hoping that this project ends up being, or part of this project ends up being, is a more functional analysis of the way in which, not the way in which these networks function, but how what these networks actually look like. So the whole idea of sort of looking at it not only nationally but internationally is to think about, well, it might not just be, C. Wright Mills was understandably sort of talking on a very national level, but actually it might well be that we have essentially an economic elite that functions across country borders and has an outsized influence on elections all over the place in terms of the way in which they think about the electoral marketplace. If we go back to CTF, that's Crosby, Textor, and I can't remember who the F is. I'm ever so sorry for whoever the F is in CTF. But although I think he's left now, I think it's now CT. But that is that's an Australian consultancy organisation, effectively led by Linton Crosby and Mark Textor. So we know that there are people that function across borders and have some kind of influence on election campaigns. And does that reflect the sort of economic elite domination that C. Wright Mills was talking about? I think I agree with you, John, that one of the more troubling things about the past 2 weeks has been this notion that again and again what we're seeing is that it's not just sort of bad apples, if you will. It's that we have some kind of something underpinning the way that democracy functions in the UK, in which elites, however you want to put it, have some kind of outsized voice on the debate and are leveraging that outsized voice on the debate in all manner of ways, and then perhaps trying to change the rules. But actually, the way in which the wealth is functioning is something that in society is something that C. Wright Mills talked about, and then we perhaps moved away from in political science ever so much, ever so slightly. And I think it's something that, that might need an update in terms of more functional sort of sociological theory, for sure.
Great, thanks very much, Sam. We don't have any other questions showing at the moment, so I'm just going to abuse my position a little bit more. So it's probably a technical question actually relating to that idea about redactions, but also the missing data. And I just wondered, does the Electoral Commission do any verification? And are there sanctions for submitting incomplete invoices? Could I, as a party, put in a completely fake invoice for a service that I hadn't received, and maybe even a company that didn't exist? Would anyone know? And if they found out, would there be a sanction for that? I guess is my sort of technical question there. And then my other question is, when you were presenting, there was one thing that really caught my eye, and I have to ask, I'm afraid, is there a political party in Britain that is giving out boxing gloves as part of its campaign?
That would be Boris Johnson boxing gloves. So yeah, we actually have a Word document or a Google Doc which it's about 20 pages long, and I'm more than welcome to share it with anyone. With all the sort of fun invoices that we found, but boxing gloves are one of them. The Liberal Democrats, I think, spent about £10,000 on puppets for something, but you have all kinds of weird and wonderful spending, but boxing gloves is certainly one of them, and that's, there's all kinds of weird merchandise. So yeah, it's Boris Johnson boxing gloves. In terms of the slightly technical question, I know one thing I know the answer to, and one thing I don't know the answer to. One is that if you supply false invoices, or indeed don't supply invoices, then it's the rules. So it is a problem if you don't, or you can be investigated by the Electoral Commission if you don't. Generally, my understanding of the way the Electoral Commission functions is that they like to push you in the right direction rather than necessarily immediately sanction you, which, to be honest, I broadly agree with as an approach. The one thing that I don't know, and I'd love to ask them, and I keep on meaning to, because I have meetings with them every now and again, is whether anyone does actually go through the invoices, because I suspect they don't. But I don't know whether that's the case, whether there is someone at the Electoral Commission that is going through every invoice, or whether we are literally the first people to have done this, because there are all kinds of issues with the data. And again, once we've crunched the numbers a little bit better, we'll be able to have an exact number, or we'll have an exact sort of figure on exactly how much money was just blank invoices, so we have no idea what was on there, exactly how much money was on invoices that was completely unclear. But I would love to know if there is anyone whose job it is at the Electoral Commission to actually go through them. I know that it's an offence if you do submit a wrong invoice. I don't know whether anyone's actually checking that.
Sorry, on mute. I would have thought I would have learned by now, but thank you very much. That's great. Okay, since we don't see any other questions and we are pretty much at time anyway. Oh, hang on, one's just popped in, Sam Hamburger. Quick question, forgive my ignorance, is there any official oversight of the Electoral Commission? Do your findings, along with their acknowledgement of the system's shortcomings, signal a failure of this oversight?
I'm guessing that's the Sam Hamburger that I did my MA with a long time ago. So nice to see you, Sam, or hear from you. So there is some oversight of the Electoral Commission. The Conservative Party is suggesting much more Conservative Party oversight of the Electoral Commission at the moment, which I have significant issues with. But the Electoral Commission do have to present reports to Parliament, and you know, have some level of oversight into the way in which they function from other organisations and other institutions. I would suggest that this is this is not necessarily an issue with the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Commission's outlook. I would suggest it would be an issue with the Electoral Commission's resourcing. My position on a functioning electoral management body or Electoral Commission is that they need broadly three things. They need broadly two things to function well. One is resources and one is independence. The Electoral Commission at the moment isn't resourced as well as it should be, such that it's actually very hard for them to do any of this kind of oversight work. And currently their independence is under threat. So I would suggest that it's not necessarily that the Electoral Commission needs to be sanctioned for this, but where we see issues with the database, that highlights that the database should be improved and the Electoral Commission should be given the money to improve it.
Okay, we've got one other questioner popping in, so we've not got much time, but Roxana, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just have, thank you, Sam, for the fascinating talk. I came a little bit late, but I don't have really a question. I just have just a suggestion. I was absolutely fascinated by what you've just said, because the difference, I think this research could work so well in comparative perspective, like you've already mentioned, because the difference with other countries is amazing. So yeah, if you could expand to other countries, I think that would be amazing. And the other thing, building up from a question from before about elite theory from a sociological perspective, I think it's not even about economic elites. I think it's about any kind of elite that is not even abusing its power. It's just working on the assumption that there are no limits, there are no boundaries, which actually the implication for our theories about corruption, especially at top levels, is huge, especially when we define what corruption is and conflict of interest and that sort of thing. So yeah, thank you. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I agree in terms of comparisons. The problem is that the UK's transparency regime is incredibly permissive and many aren't. So it's quite hard to do the research in those areas. And again, seconded on the sort of elites that like to push the boundaries of what is and isn't acceptable. I think that would be quite a neat one-sentence summary of what we've seen in the past 2 weeks, or at least how the Conservative Party got themselves into so much trouble with the Owen Paterson thing in the first place.
Fantastic. Okay, just remains for me to say thank you everyone for coming. Thank you very much, Sam, for a great talk. And do check out the next research seminar, which is January 21st, Dan Hough talking about Donald Trump and legal corruption. So if you follow us on Twitter, all the details should be around on there, and we'll also be mailing them out again. Thanks, everybody, and big thank you to Sam. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
No problem.
Useful?
Yeah, as always, useful to talk these things through. We're submitting a report to IDEA in like next week, so always useful to get stuff
Great
together.
stuff. I've got a potential PhD student that I'm talking to. Been talking to her for sort of probably a year on and off actually, and she's sort of finally coming through. And she's interested in looking at state capture in, I think, Mali and Kyrgyzstan, but there's a bit of a party finance angle on it. And I just wanted to sound you out on whether you'd potentially be interested in being a co-supervisor or not. So yeah, countries are probably not particularly your area, and the party finance bit, I think, it's a bit unclear whether she's going to go in that direction or not yet. But yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, no. So certainly, if there's a kind of if there's an angle in which I would be useful, then and it sounds very interesting, you know, state capture stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, certainly.
Okay.
Would be.
I think she'd be a good student. She's looks like quite a high flyer to me. And the other thing about it is she's got a possibility of an OECD internship in the first half of next year, but only if she's registered as a student.
Right.
So there is a bit of an issue that she's asking if we could sort of rush her through the application process, but she probably wouldn't actually do that much in the first 6 months. So I don't know, again, how you feel about that, if you're open to that.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes, say, generally, I can be a little bit anxious about, say, but it strikes me that it's less that she wants to do a PhD so she can do the OECD internship. Yeah. But two things that the OECD internship would be dependent. So she wants to do a PhD anyway and would like to do it so she can do the OECD internship. Because I sort of thought that there was, or sometimes there's some students who don't know what they want to do, so they're like, oh, no,
I'm pretty convinced on that actually, just because it's been in this sort of on and off conversation for quite a long time. So yeah, I don't think she's just sort of using us. It's just that it's become a bit more urgent, whereas I think she was thinking she'd start in September.
Okay, well, that sort of sounds broadly good then.
Okay, well, I'm going to have a chat to her. I'll try and find out what's going on and what the party finance angle is, and then maybe I'll send over the draft that I've got for you to have a look at.
Cool.
Great. Thanks again.
All right. Have a good one.
See you soon.